Hello, and welcome to the 14th episode of Recluse Horror. This is a daily horror movie review podcast. Just a little background on the project. Back in April of last year, I decided that I wanted to watch and review a horror movie every single day. I have done so for the past 281 days, I want to say. But only the last 14 have been, including today, have been podcasts. Everything before was text reviews. So, ran into a bunch of problems today. I started watching like three or four different movies today, and for one reason or another, I couldn't watch it. Either I knew somebody else who wanted to watch it with me, who couldn't, and one of them, the first one I tried to watch, the plot was exactly the same premise as one of the ones I've already reviewed for the podcast. So I don't really want to give those two close together. So I'll probably wait to watch that one. And then another person was in the middle of watching one with me and then didn't want me to finish it without them, but they couldn't finish the movie. So, it's another short film today, unfortunately. Again, I like the short films, but I know that most people are probably more interested in commercial films as far as like what they want to see reviews of. So yeah, I don't mean to do so many of them. It's just been a bunch of bullcrap recently, basically. So every episode I do one movie that I've just watched that very day. In this case, it's a short film. And I do another that I have reviewed previously in text and just go over any other impressions that I still happen to have left and sort of follow along with my review to make sure there's not anything that I'm leaving out that I can, that I could possibly talk about. So the short film today is Rake from 2015. This was actually based on a creepypasta, which I did not know when I sat down to watch it. I actually have never been on creepypasta before today. It never really had any appeal because by the time I found out like what it really was, which for those of you not knowing, it's sort of original short stories by just random people who upload them. They're usually horror stories, maybe exclusively horror stories. Again, I've never really been on the site. But, just by the time I found out about creepypasta, like, it was getting to the point where, like, every sort of creepy little thing you saw on the internet, like a picture of something, like, every time you do something, it's really this happening. And everyone would be like, oh, that sounds like a creepypasta. And it would always be the most inane things to me. So, I don't know, the site never really had, much appeal to me. I have read a number of the SCP stories, but that's pretty much the only stuff like that I've read. And I guess they're kind of similar in some ways, but they're a different kind of... It just seems like a different beast from what I can understand. Anyway, so after I watched the movie and I saw like somebody was like, oh, I really like this creepypasta, and I'm like, what? This is a creepypasta story? I read the short story thing that they had. And it's pretty, it's interesting enough, I guess. It doesn't have a lot of color to it, I guess, for me personally, but it's definitely not bad. And there's some of the ways in which it doesn't have color are interesting. And that's kind of my impression of the movie as well. So the premise of the movie is basically a group of friends that are out taking a trip after college get attacked by this thing. That's pretty much all you can say about either of them. Like, that's the whole story that you can kind of explain to anybody as far as, like, what's happening in it. I liked it, actually. I thought it was kind of neat. It's clear, I mean, I guess, especially after having read the short story, it's very clear that they took the information in the short story into consideration, but they kind of made their own thing, which I enjoyed. Before I get too far, this is put out by a group called gearmark.tv, and according to their site, and I didn't check to make sure that they're still active in this regard, but it says that they put out a new short film every month. It's not always a horror one, but they do have two that are listed, they have 12 that are listed under the horror section, so and probably people who enjoy horror films, also enjoy other types of films. So you could definitely check out their YouTube channel. This one was definitely better than a lot of the short films that I've, sort of watched, short horror films that I've watched recently. The one real negative of this, I would say, is the movie is about, I think, 15 minutes, and they spend like half of it on this backstory. It's a little less than half, but this backstory that's kind of unnecessary. They definitely didn't need to spend as much time on it as they did, especially since they were pretty vague about the details. It kind of seemed like maybe they were going for something like in the short story of it. And in the short story, often there's incomplete information about certain encounters and so forth. And it seemed like they were sort of trying to build that into a visual, sort of narrative there. So I appreciate it on that level, but it still didn't need to be half of the length, in my opinion. And it still didn't need to be, you didn't need to build in things that the answer really doesn't, the answer is never given to the audience. I think, again, in that way, I think they were trying to emulate the short story, which is pretty clever, but it still felt like I was just missing something while I was watching it. Again, I didn't know the short story before, or even that it was a creepypasta. So take that as what you will. If you're familiar with the story, then maybe you wouldn't feel that way. So the production value was pretty good. The location in which they filmed was interesting without being, terribly distracting in any way. The acting, there were a couple of rough spots, but mostly it was pretty good. It's definitely more believable than some of the short films that I've seen, especially considering like how freaked out they were at certain points. I actually felt like they were kind of more in their element when they were freaked out, whereas some of the dialogue, it felt a little rough, like the actors didn't really know each other or have a sense of each other quite yet. I'm sure it was a short filming schedule. I'm sure it all happened very quickly, so they may not have had a lot of time to really develop any chemistry of any kind. But yeah, when they started getting into the horror stuff, I think they really got into their groove. Which is, what you want out of a horror film, and definitely a horror short film. So the thing that attacks them, I thought the design was maybe a little bit on the standard side for new horror movies, but in a short film, a costume like that is pretty impressive. I thought it looked really neat. They definitely build in some lore there that isn't explained, but even before I had known it was based on something, like, it was the appealing sort of lack of information. It was the kind of stuff that makes you, like, really interested and not really annoyed that they didn't answer the question. To me, if they had, sort of ended the movie with just, oh, they got attacked and, oh no, it's going to attack them, or they got away, or however it ends, I'm not going to tell you, then it would have just left one of those things like, well, they don't give any explanation for what the thing is that attacked them. They don't really explain very well what it's capable of. They don't do this, they don't do that. If they hadn't added those questions in towards the end of the movie, then I think it would have a little bit felt like, there's no reason to watch this. This is just it's a monster flick, but with no individuality. There's no reason to watch this. That's how I kind of felt, and I know I've talked about this one before, and I won't get to the review of it for quite a while, unfortunately, because I watched it pretty recently before, just before I transitioned from the text reviews to the podcast. But in She, they didn't give you any lore. A thing attacks, essentially, and then you never find out any information about the character who's attacked or the thing that's attacking that person. So this added some very intriguing questions towards the end of the movie, and actually, sort of from the start of the movie, that made it like, oh, I'd really like to see information about this, or I'd like to see a sequel to this, or whatever. And they could definitely do another sequel, but I think the thing about the Rake, considering the story and, like I said, the incomplete information that's in the story, sort of spells out that you're not really ever going to find those answers, so it's probably unnecessary to do a sequel. But it's also kind of a shame because, like I said, like, that's the monster, like, costume that they had for that was really good. And it seems kind of a waste not to use it for more things. I mean, and maybe they have used it in other things, but yeah. I don't really know what else to talk about with this. It's hard to spend a lot of time on a on a short film unless it's really bad and you just want to pick it apart. But I was pleasantly surprised by this one. The lighting was good. The pacing probably could have been better. Like I said, the first half of the movie didn't need to be backstory necessarily. Especially since it mentions backstory elements that we never find out about and have no reason to care about and aren't fully explained. But again, I think that just emulates the old story, so that's just a personal criticism. There were definitely a couple of instances in the film where I felt like, where the characters were acting the most stupid that you can act in a horror movie, just doing those things that regular people wouldn't do. But those can be kind of hard to avoid in short films, I find. It's just sort of they don't have enough time to show them making all the right decisions and still failing. So I didn't really count that too negatively, although there were a couple of times when I did find myself a little agitated by it because it was so egregious in one particular case. Honestly, I don't think it totally negatively impacted the film, and it definitely didn't ruin the ending for me. So I don't know. I think by the end, everything kind of comes around in a way that I felt was interesting. Some people still may be annoyed by it. Yeah. You should, if you're into horror, it's definitely on the upper half of the ones that I've seen. I still think I liked Pigskin better, but this is definitely, not a bad choice. And there are a couple other ones that I reviewed in text that I haven't yet done reviews of on the podcast that are really good, but those will be a long time coming, because I really started watching more of the short films towards the end of when I started to transition. Anyway, that was Rake from 2015. You can find it on gearmark.tv. Okay, so the next one that I want to talk about, mind you, not that any of you guys probably would know this because my reviews were private when they were in text form, but I am skipping ahead a bit. There's a number of films that I would like to have Sam on for. That are coming up in this particular period. There were a bunch of them that he saw with me that I'd really like to discuss with him, because either we have differing opinions, or he really liked it, or I really liked it and he didn't, and I wanted, I don't know, for whatever reason, I want him to be on a lot of these ones. So I'm skipping ahead to one called Mercy from 2014, because even though I think he's seen this one, I don't know if he saw it with me, but I think he's seen it. It is completely bland and mediocre, so there's not really any reason to talk about it with him, because we're just going to say it was terrible. I mean, not even terrible. If it were terrible, there would be something more to talk about. So I might actually add another third story back onto this one, because I can't imagine I'll talk about this one for a long time. Anyway, so Mercy from 2014. It's a movie about a grandmother, Mercy, who's nearing the end of her life when her daughter and grandchildren come back to the family home to take care of her. Mercy's sudden turn for the worse, the peculiar happenings in the home over the years, and the talk around town come together to make her grandson George believe there's more than meets the eye as to what's going on. Based on the short story Grandma by Stephen King, this was a direct-to-video release and felt every bit of one. That's my original synopsis straight from the text review, because I remember almost nothing about this except for it being just terribly mediocre. So it had a fair amount of familiar faces to it, a weird amount for how bad this movie turned out to be. Dylan McDermott is one of them. He was in the first season of American Horror Story, and he may have been in some of the other ones. Frances O'Connor, who is in AI, Mark Duplass from The League and Creep 2, which I previously reviewed, and they all played supporting roles opposite Shirley Knight, who's had one of the most steady and stable careers in Hollywood. She's fantastic. This movie doesn't really, it's sort of a waste to have her in this movie, if you ask me. The actor who plays George, who's the grandson that I mentioned before, his name is Chandler Riggs, and apparently he was on The Walking Dead. But I only watched the first season of that, and I could barely stand it. So, I'm sure that's not a popular opinion among horror fans, but I read the comics and I couldn't stand the series. So, the acting, despite having all of those big names, is probably fair to middling, sadly. Like I said, I think that Shirley Knight did a very good job, as I recall, but she's just sort of underutilized, and it's not a good movie, so it seems kind of like squandered talent there. The effects in CG are okay. They aren't really great, but there's so much bad CG out there that, like, even having middle of the road CGI these days seems like the best you can hope for. I used to be a lot more down on CGI in general because even the best of it wasn't very good, but I've been subjected to so much since I started this, project back in April that I think I've become a little bit less sensitive to bad CG at this point, or at least middling CG. I've developed somewhat of a tolerance for it, which is probably for the better, honestly. CGI isn't going away, and I don't mind it when it's done well, but it just so, like, the Peter Jackson King Kong has phenomenal CGI, so why are films made in 2017, 2018, probably, I haven't seen any with a lot of CG in 2018 yet, but it just seems, it seems like the baseline should be a little bit higher by this point, and I don't think it is. In addition to that, the makeup wasn't really that great, especially considering how much they must have paid to acquire all of those actors. It seems really silly that they didn't, that they decided to skimp on the makeup. The cinematography was rather nice, actually, though, and the lighting was mostly pretty good. There weren't any real problems with the level of the light, and some of it was pretty artful. So that's probably the best feature of the movie, is the lighting and cinematography, in my recollection. The plot started out on sort of the right track, but it gets kind of disappointing by the midpoint, and by the end, it's just worse. Like, everything that happens, it feels like they zigged when they should have zagged, which is just irritating to me. I know that horror movies like to throw in unimportant characters as cannon fodder, but a lot of the cannon fodder left a lot of loose, plot threads behind that really could have been tied up very easily with very minor tweaks to the story. Most of it could have been done through, like, ADR or, something like that. It just felt lazy to me. There's a particular moment that in the review I tell exactly what happened, but without naming any of the characters. I think I'll avoid doing that this time, just because if you know specifically what it is, then, it's, I don't know, it's not worth watching. I still won't do it, though. But anyway, there's a particular area in the film where you think they're going to zig, and instead they zag. And it kind of ruins the movie. It made me so incredibly angry. I remember being just completely upset that they did that. They lead you to believe something happened because of one character for the whole movie, and then right at the end, they throw in this other character and say that he or she did it. I don't even remember if the other character was, what gender the character was. But I have a particular pet peeve, and I know that I've mentioned this before, about filmmakers specifically lying to the audience. They spend all of this time building in this other character, and there's nothing that leads up to to the character that supposedly really did it. And then after that, and I went back and checked, I remember when I watched it, that other character, the character that supposedly caused everything to happen or whatever, they never show them on screen again for the rest of the movie. So you never get any explanation about why this happened, or what motivation they could have, or what happened to them because of it. Like, they give you nothing. And if they had just said that it was the other person, then you wouldn't need any such explanation. It just would be completely unnecessary. I understand that sometimes scenes get cut for one reason or another, and I'm imagining that that's what happened in this particular case. But if you decided to cut that explanation out of the film, I don't understand how you could possibly not switch who is responsible. So to fix it would have cost, maybe 3 lines of dialogue that needed to be corrected. And if you were clever, you could have covered it all with, like I said, with editing and ADR to avoid a reshoot. Instead, it's just an unmotivated, lazy plot twist with no resolution. It's really frustrating. There's a ton of stuff that plays out in this movie. I mean, this is the worst of it, I think, but there's a ton of stuff that plays out like this in the movie. There's a bunch of setups that have no follow-through, and you can almost write those ones off as trying to deceive the audience, like I said, into thinking that they're not going to, do that thing that they end up doing. It seems like this movie probably was just cut to ribbons during the editing process. I got that impression while I was watching it not the first time. I would never rewatch this movie. But it's always frustrating when they go all the way through a movie only to be killed off in post-production. Like, to spend all of that time, and effort making a movie and then deciding, oh, well, actually, we don't think the producers don't think audiences will respond to this. We're already wrapped on filming, so I guess all we can do is just cut this. I don't know if that's what happened, but I remember having that impression when I watched it, so... As I have definitely mentioned before on the very Stephen King episode that I did before, I have read a ton of Stephen King. A family friend got me a box of novels that I don't know whether they were throwing them out or they just told her to take them or what, because she worked at this thrift store. And it had at that time in history, Stephen King books were what you found in those. Maybe you still do. But so I had a ton of Stephen King novels, and this is the first time that I have seen anything, whether bad or good, out of a Stephen King adaptation that I felt like was so mediocre that I have no interest in reading the short story. And it's a short story. Like, every time I watch a really bad adaptation of Stephen King, I'm like, how did this happen? I have to read this, I have to read the story. I have to read the book that it's based on, because how could they, screw this up so bad? And it's the same thing with the good ones. Like, oh, this is really good. I bet there's a lot more information in it if you read the book. And, sometimes I follow through with that and sometimes I don't. This is probably the only time I can think of where watching one of the adaptations hasn't made me want to watch it. And I have seen a ton of Stephen King adaptations, some of which I still have to review, actually. Or review for the podcast, at least. I think probably everybody knows which one I'm talking about that came out recently on a very popular platform. But that'll be a while. But yeah, I mean, it was just completely mediocre. That's really, honestly, all I have to say about it. Everything could have been better. The cinematography is not too bad. The lighting is not too bad. But, the pacing is kind of funny. The story is just... There's so many plot threads that never get resolved, and it's just bland and nothing. I am assuming that probably this was intended to be an actual Hollywood film that was released into theaters, and whatever happened, the production fell through, and they're like, well, we're just going to release this, direct to video, because, this movie is so bad there isn't an audience for it. Maybe somebody will get duped into buying it. So, or watching it on Netflix, which is what I did. It's still on there. Don't watch it. As for people that I think will be interested in seeing it, the only people I can really think of is, diehard Stephen King fans that somehow, didn't hear about this adaptation. And that actually might be the only group I can think of who would enjoy this. Usually I'm a little better at that. I don't know, maybe if you... No, I think that's it. I'm trying to come up with somebody else because I always try to, even on movies that are bad, I usually find there's somebody out there who will like it. And I'm sure there are people out there who do like this. I just don't know who they are. And I definitely, don't know their demographic to let you know if you're in it. So, view at your own risk, I guess. So I actually paused the recorder just now to see which of my reviews during this period I could do. I was going to add another one on top of it. But even after, jumping ahead 10 entries or something like that, everything that's coming up is either something that I want to have Sam for, or it's going to be another Pan, and I don't want to do too many negative reviews in a row. Not that Rake was a negative review, it certainly wasn't, but with having just gotten myself angry about how mediocre Mercy is, I think I'm just going to call it a night. The next few that I can do without Sam, or I feel like I would be willing to do without Sam, are all stuff that I just really didn't like, or that are really weird, in a way that requires, probably some discussion. So yeah, I guess I'm gonna call this one. Oh, by the way, I don't know if I mentioned specifically, when I mentioned the title of this to Sam as like the next one that I could do on my own, he was like, "What is that?" And I told him the basic premise of the story, and he's like, "Are you sure I watched that?" And then I told him more about it, and he's like, "I have no memory of that, but I am pretty sure I watched it." So there's the Sam portion of the review. I did it for him. He has no memory of this at all, even with pretty detailed plot explanations, and me reading parts of my review directly to him. So, definitely forgettable. Okay, so I guess that's the end of my Mercy review. So yeah, I guess that's gonna do it. If you enjoyed this, please share it with the people that you love or hate or whatever. You can also like, comment, review, rate, whatever site you found this on. If you found it on a place where you don't particularly like the platform, I have also released the show to Stitcher, iTunes, YouTube, Podcast Addict, and a ton of other podcatchers. So feel free to use any of those methods to watch the show. I'm also on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and I actually am starting to put stuff up. It's probably only ever going to be posters of the movies that I review. But if you're ever interested in seeing any of the movie posters to see if that gives you a better idea of whether you want to watch something, you can certainly follow me on Instagram. Yeah, but I guess that's about it. If you'd like to email me, if you want to, spend 30 pages letting me know why Mercy is the best movie ever made, you can send that to reclusehorror@gmail.com, or, direct message me or whatever on any of those other accounts I mentioned. So, anyway, yeah, I think that'll about do it. Have a great night.